Before we begin, I have a few thank yous. The first is to our interim provost and long-term supporter of the WKU Forensics team, David Lee. The second is to my coaches, Jessica Ferguson, Chad Meadows, Spencer Olowski, Susan Taylor, and our Director of Forensics, Gaynor Newman. I really appreciate the opportunity for letting me come join what I consider to be a legacy, and I'm so proud to be able to throw my fours up. And my third thank you is to my teammates. You've all punished me in practice rounds, each of them more than once. And I'm a product of your hard work, and I really appreciate each and every one of you. And the fourth thank you is to my mom and my grandmother. I just want to say to my mother that you are the most amazing person that I've ever met. And I remember when we used to have to sleep in the same bed because we had no money and we had no food, and you told me to get better, and you were right. And I love you. The 1AC.
Thank you so much. Give me a second, sorry. Sorry, it's asking me to format it.
Sure.
Apparently it will erase all data on the disk, so.
Just hit cancel, it'll probably still pull up. If it doesn't flip right away, go to my computer and select the drive.
Oh goodness, this is embarrassing. Yeah, it's not doing it. So I'll go ahead and just let this go. I'll pay attention.
Yeah, I can flash it again. I can try, see if it.
I think my computer just won't format your disk for some reason, so it's totally fine.
You sure?
Yeah.
Do you want to try this one?
Try. Sure.
Oh!
And this is why I don't play softball.
Thank you. Use. Speech 1AC NFA finals.
Mhm.
Okay.
Are we all good? Observation 1, its harms is inherency. Subpoint A, biopiracy violates basic human rights, culturally appropriates and strips indigenous populations of food and shelter. This is Johannes Terwal, Case West University, 2012. She explains, the worst effects of biopiracy are borne by people living in these struggling nations. Biopiracy comprises centralized medical therapies for SAR outreach of these communities and deplete resources used for food and shelter by indigenous people. Developing nations are complicit in acts of biopiracy or violating the basic human rights that have helped enshrine the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Biopiracy goes further to erode the psyche and identity of culture that affects ignoring the human rights principles confounded in the covenant of social, economic, cultural rights. The appropriation of biological resources tied to traditional knowledge returns relatively necessary nations back to their colonial past through the exploitation and degradation of people's cultures. The B argument. This biopiracy continues unchecked because the United States federal government does not have adequate prior informed consent laws now. This makes the failure of indigenous communities inevitable and is a prerequisite to all other alternatives. This is Megan Pierce, Associate Editor, Michigan Journal of International Law, October 2014. She explains, the conflicts analysis concerning the interpretation of the FPIC can be seen by the United States by the Committee of Relations Racial Discrimination. The United States interpretation deprives the principle and goes to meet significance and consequence and general purpose because consultation does not require arguments from indigenous communities. Many projects within the United States have continued to go forward without the affected indigenous communities. The ineffectiveness of a simple consultation standard, for example, and the United States southern border wall was built through traditional lands that launch Apache with real consultation, let alone consent, and tribes threatened the very existence. See? These persistent violations of prior informed consent cause violence. Recognizing communities' rights to consent is crucial to the survival of hundreds of millions. This is Brant McGee, UC Berkeley Journal of International Law, 2009. The concept of prior informed consent and is based on the rights of participation, consultation, and self-determination, indigenous property rights. The catastrophic consequences of unwarranted activity post-development stems from violation of prior informed consent and are often lost in academic discussions. Conflicts brings violence in the forms of killing and injuries. Previous culture norms disinterrogate the new cash economy, bringing decisiveness to promotes previous unknown censored conduct and land water before pollute destroyed the game population is crucial. Substance nutritional bylaws and family authorized placing different corporate activities entire together. These impacts are not like those of war recognition and right to consent. It's critical to survive 100 millions of people. D, failure to ensure self-determination fuels neocolonialistic practices by exploiting the resources in non-Western communities, justifies intervention, and makes conflicts inevitable. This is Marcia Jackson, University of Berkeley School of Law, 2009. The United States currently wields superpower status through neocolonial foreign policy, economic policies as a form of colonialism. The core of neocolonialism is infringed upon other sovereignty and self-determination. Furthermore, neocolonialism, like formal colonialism, involves the oppression of people, exploitation of land and resources, and acquisition of wealth empowered by the colonized by renaming the colonized impoverished, powerless, and dependent upon the colonized forces. Additionally, justifies intervention and dominance of others and stimulates the belief that colonizers are superior to authorization and colonizers are intrinsically bringing back civilization. The plain text. The United States federal government should substantially increase restrictions on bioprospecting by implementing the prior informed consent disclosure requirement for patent applications as per Grevian 10. Solvency A. Prior informed consent gives indigenous communities the ability to withhold their consent from engaging in bioprocessing activities. This is Laura Grebe, Marquette University School of Law. Shout out to the Golden Eagles, May 2010. An application for prior informed consent must contain the scope of research and possible impacts as a part of the impact agreements. However, applicants must enter into benefit sharing agreements that identify conservation methods that will be taken to preserve the species being researched and limit disruption of the ecosystem. Requiring research to disclose prior informed consent will also encourage conservation by putting local communities, people who know the resource that best in charge of their use. If a resource is run low or further movement of resource will endanger the local balance of ecosystems, the community can withhold their consent to preserve the resource. B. Mandating consultation enables indigenous communities to assume a position of power, deterring any kind of bioprospecting and restoring self-determination. This is Richard Conniff, University of Washington Conservation Magazine, March 9, 2012. One possible reason for the discovery process stumbled lately is that government agencies have become more aggressive in negotiating access to benefit sharing in terms of research, particularly in the developing world. These negotiations tend to be shaped by resentment of past biopolicy and uncertainty about the affair. Marked with value of genetic resource for each new negotiation starts from technical until months of even significant travel expense before any selection is made. In 1989, the United States Consumer Institute, whose team was working with the Cameroon compound. This was a plant still engaging in dollars, was not making risk all way, even if the compounds have proven to be curative. I'm not sure we've been able to work with them because they're put such tight clamps on it. This C argument. Prior informed consent ensures that indigenous communities' right to self-determination is protected. This is Loyal Doe, Massachusetts University School of Law, 13. Prior informed consent has a right to collective self-determination. Respect for the right to self-determination is part of the right to collective decision-making. Indigenous people also view prior informed consent as a process of operationalizing self-determination by guaranteeing respect for their decision-making processes and associate their right to reject or accept programs that affect them. These are essential for indigenous people who have confidence in external process systems in the context of prior informed consent. Indigenous people are able to realize their economic, cultural rights to obtain culturally appropriate equitable benefits. The D argument. The ability to reject corporate activities is a prerequisite to the survival of indigenous communities, as McGee previously cited. The exploitation without consent represents the greatest threat to the inability of minority populations to protect their cultural rights and social structures, meaning livelihood in a way of foreign minds of destruction. Land and resources taken without prior informed consent must be returned. If this is not possible, there must be fair compensation paid insofar as the possible forms of territories. Land is much more viable than any financial compensation. Mandating schemes in which the wrong exploitation of land resource without consent can be addressed. This connection with the land universally understood with those who own the crop and hunting food together decide the same comprehensive recognition of modern developers and state institutions the right to control the development of their lands and resources, as well as the right to choose and reject corporate activities on land, are fundamental prerequisites to indigenous survival as independent people to enact culture and society. The E argument. Ensuring prior informed consent is a prerequisite to avoiding conflicts, curbing deforestation, global warming, and food insecurities. This is Meyer Cunningham, PhD, April 12, 2016. Evidence shows that prior informed consent is an appropriate tool for demanding, regulating forest management, contract agreements, and ensuring an open, ongoing, and equitable relationship between developing stakeholders. Conflicts over the resource and land use of natural have become commonplace in the regions of the world. Attractive industrial policies in indigenous territories reveal a number of sources of conflict. Inadequate or non-existing legal safeguards. Inadequate impact assessments not fulfillment of the state's duty to consult indigenous people and safeguard measures to protect their rights.
All right. Are we ready for cross X? Sweet. how does the plan restrict bioprospecting?
Because it puts restrictions on bioprospecting directly.
Like how so?
By requiring patent applications before any bioprospecting can commence.
Okay, so after the plan, given indigenous consultation, can bioprospecting still occur?
The plan regulates the United States' private companies' ability to negotiate in bioprospecting terms.
Okay, that's fair. So the 1AC is a process of regulating bioprospecting?
It's a restriction.
I mean, you just said it was a regulation.
Okay, I can use the term synonymously. I'll defend that.
Okay, that's fair. So I want to talk about your harms, right? So basically the 1AC is saying that biopiracy affects indigenous self-determination on multiple levels, correct?
That's the Sorrel 12 card.
Yes. So how does prior informed consent and negotiation ensure that self-determination is actualized?
There are two reasons we do so. First, Grebe evidence indicates that indigenous communities now have the power to accept or reject programs that affect their livelihood, specifically their ecosystems. In addition, my Connell 12 card says that post the 1AC, there is a deterrent mechanism to prevent bioprospecting from happening inside indigenous communities. In addition to that, my Doyle 13 evidence indicates that the ability to consult is self-determination, because in the status quo, that ability does not exist.
So the impacts to the affirmative besides indigenous exploitation and self-determination is this subpoint E card on observation 2. It's avoiding conflict. What kind of conflict?
My McCunningham evidence indicates that without prior informed consent, it literally pits indigenous communities against one another, and that conflict exists now.
Okay, that's fair. How does it resolve deforestation?
Two reasons. First, Grebe evidence indicates that in the status quo, deforestation is occurring because bioprospecting is unregulated.
Where does it say that?
That's the Grebe evidence.
The Grebe evidence, so not the Cunningham evidence.
That's the second part. I'm getting there.
Okay, that's fine.
The Connell 12 evidence indicates that because the negotiation process would be so hard, that bioprospecting activities wouldn't even take place post-plan, which means that we're able to solve deforestation because it never occurs.
What is the role of the negative in this debate?
To negate the resolution.
How do I negate the resolution? I mean, that's very true, but
I'm not going to tell you your role.
Okay,
you could affirm it if you'd like.
Damon, sure. All right. I think I'm good. All right, so I guess I gotta do a thank you speech. First, I want to thank the administration and Board of Trustees at Kansas City, Kansas Community College, specifically our Dean, Dr. Walker, our Vice President of Academics, Dr. Vitale, our Chief Financial Officer, Dr. Lindahl, our Dean of Students, Dr. Long, and Andrika Wilcoxon, Director of Student Activities, along with our President, Dr. Givens, all of the faculty and staff that show tremendous support for our program. Our Board of Trustees are putting value in what we do that allow for us as a community college to participate in every forensics association imaginable and attempt to travel to multiple national tournaments that span across speech, debate, acting, and interpretation. I want to show some tremendous love and support to the teammates that have supported me these 4 years while I've been at KCC. First, I want to thank Maggie Unruh. I remember seeing you at debate tournaments while I was an assistant coach at my old high school at Lawrence, Kansas. You showed a form of silent presence that made it known that you own the room and that you own the debate. I'm excited to see you go to Emporia State University on a music scholarship. I want to thank Dylon Willett for being one of the top 5 greatest rappers of all time. But for real, Dylan has a huge amount of work ethic and shows a real hunger for success. And your help has been instrumental to get me to where I am right now. The same goes for Alan Easley. For an entire year, I've been helping you grow in debate, and you have helped me understand how important friendship and connection is here on a team that travels constantly. Love you, Alan. That also goes for our forensic squad for Tyler and Nashawn. While I know we didn't travel very much in debate and interp events can be seen as very clashing and isolated with one another, I want you to know that y'all's energy and support means a lot to me, and I hope that y'all continue to be successful. I also want to thank Matt Costas, Nicole Nave, Anthony Joseph, Brian Gonzaba, and Ryan McFarland. All 5 of you have been absolutely instrumental in helping shape my debate skills and emotional stability through these past 4 years. I love you all, and I wish you were here, but I guess Ryan doesn't love me anymore since he always dips from these tournaments. I want to thank the coaches that have helped me throughout over my entire debate career. First is Jeff Plinsky, my high school debate coach, and now my boss. Even though I entered forensics through an administrative mistake, I used to be an actor actually. It was the best mishap to ever happen in my life, and your continual support and joy has made me want to be the very best every time for all 7 years that I've been in debate. I want to thank Toya Green. Even though you were never an official coach, you were instrumental in helping me find myself with a community that seems to create fire and drama around every corner. I love everything about you and everything that you do, and I can never show enough support. Third, Ryan Wash, the champ. Another unofficial coach. You were the one that challenged me to understand more and more about the arguments that I run. I needed that motivation, and seeing someone as intelligent as you are to give me even the time of day makes me feel so valuable. Fourth, I want to thank David Bowers. You were never an official coach, but you were one of the few people in the community that I found an unconditional friendship with. You were the absolute best to help me get things in perspective, whether it's in or outside a debate round. And I love you, buddy. Sorry, I'm not going for wipeout in this debate, though. I also want to thank Justin Parks. He has transitioned to be a quasi-assistant coach. He's actually here at this tournament. Justin used to be my old debate partner. I love you, Justin. You're always one of those people that just kind of like calms me down and knows exactly what I need to do and focus on at that moment. I also want to thank Scott Elliott. Thanks for driving the van, getting us food, sending me all them URLs, and giving me the undivided attention for my first year at KCK. I always appreciate your dedication towards the team. Sixth, I want to thank Sohail Joya, one of the most influential people that I have met in my life. You're so passionate and caring, and I can never repay all the time and energy you have spent in making me a better debater and a better person. And I hope I didn't frustrate you too much. I want you to know that while I'm on this stage, all I can think about is three things. First, quack! Second, I love you. Three, can I get 2 claps into Ric Flair? Woo! Finally, Darren Elliott, Chief. You have made such a positive impact in my life. As a coach, not only did you help me expand my knowledge, but you also helped me feel valued in an activity that can really bring you down. Darren has helped me in more ways than I can count in and outside of debate, and I can never explain in words how much you have done for me or how much you mean to me. Honestly, I don't debate for personal recognition. I debate to prove to the community how spectacular of a coach you are. I would never have gotten here without you, and I can't wait to have that first place trophy sitting in the middle of your desk. Finally, John Williams, J-Dub Trey, my parley partner, my best friend that I've ever met in all my years of debate. John, you are a phenomenal person. I can't wait to see you win round after round next year at Parley. Your humor, style, and intelligence always help me round myself out. You're always accenting me in ways that I can never imagine. I want you to know I'm so happy with the impact that KCC, GW has made within all 3 debate activities, and you're going to continue that legacy. Just remember, we probably could have gotten more CC sweepstakes points if you were in, but not of, the NFALD tournament. Finally, got one more thing to say. D3, the 1NC. It is going to be 2 off. Then harms inherency and solvency. The way solvency will break down is generally, and then I'm going to get to the last impact card that talked about deforestation, warming, and food security. Tell me when you got it up. Good? Good. All right, everybody ready to go? First is my interpretation. Restrict means only outright prohibition. Effectual consequences on bioprospecting do not count. Castillo 194. The court held the word restrict referred to outright prohibitions and that a consequence is not equal a prohibition. Second is the violation. The affirmative is a regulation on bioprospecting, not a restriction. That is legally distinct. Sinhan 6. A distinction between regulation and restriction. Regulation promotes the facility, whereas prohibition shuts off. If it had been the intention to prohibit, the legislator would not use the word regulating. Next are the standards. First is limits. Regulations explode off ground and justify dozens of cases that circumvent negative offense because the links for my disads are based on prohibiting bioprospecting, and that is the only predictable route for research practices. Second is bidirectionality. Regulations make the topic bidirectional because they promote bioprospecting by making practices more efficient and ethical. It forces negative teams to debate both bioprospecting good and bad. It also proves that they have stolen key counterplaying ground. Regulation should be negative offense. Third is effects topicality. Even if they prove they restrict bioprospecting, it's only because of the effects of the plan. You should view the plan text in a vacuum. It's an independent voter. Effects are unlimiting, exploded vantage ground, allows them to spike out of disads, and mixes burdens by making topicality and solvency redundant. Overall, topicality is a voter for competitive equity in education, and you should default to competing interpretations. It's the only way to have an objective view of the topic. Reasonability is bad because it makes judge intervention inevitable. Next off. First, informed consent is not neutral technology in international relations. It is a form of cultural intervention to assimilate non-Western cultures into a model of Western liberalism and promote colonial pedagogies. Research on this proves. Sholem in 12. Informed consent is a Western concept. Informed consent relies on autonomous individuality that may not be applicable to communitarian societies. In Pakistan and Swaziland, researchers were forced to penetrate tribal hierarchy and bureaucracy to obtain informed consent. Their findings demonstrated the inadequacy and complexity of applying Western-based concepts to developing countries. The universalist push seeks to destroy difference by creating a rationale for intervention with the intent of transforming them into a liberal model. The informed consent reflects a policy judgment premise on a set of European cultural values. Second, prior informed consent still operates under a logic of public domain and protection. These ethics fracture indigenous communities and create forms of gendered violence by creating forms of universalizing logic. This homogenizes indigenous struggle. Foster and 11. Public domain revolve around an ethic of protection. The level of protection fails to consider complex gendered social relations and structural relations within indigenous communities. Attention is placed on legal technologies such as in prior informed consent. These promote universalizing logic, forcing communities to conform to Western legal models. Indigenous communities desire different levels of protection. Next, colonial logic necessitates racialized violence that makes war inevitable, and that risks extinction. Street and 4. Assaults on indigenous people set the foundational racist patterns for subsequent butchery directed at people of color. The Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq are a virtuous circle of recurrent violence. U.S. forces walk in bloody footsteps that trace back centuries. Those who deny the past will repeat their offenses. The world will face permanent war. This empire will be defended by missiles and bombs loaded with radioactive materials. And neocolonialism produces racialized, sexualized violence that makes it impossible to articulate ethics, that locks population in material and psychological conditions. Maldonado, Torres, and 8. The racial colonial world defines the reality of racialized selves. The condemned exist in a permanent hell in which the confrontation with death and murder is ordinary. The racialized and colonized subjects cannot evade or escape. Racism posits its targets as racialized, sexualized subjects that are inherently servile and whose bodies come to form a part of an economy of sexual abuse, exploitation, and control. Thus, the alternative: vote negative to reject the 1AC to endorse a decolonial pedagogy which situates land reclamation as our first political priority. Only the alternative has the radical potential to resolve colonialism. Land-centered pedagogy in search of global movement against colonialist governments means that I solve the affirmative. Malo and 8. Americans of foreign descent must become Americans to the land. You were born here, you will not go away. We must relearn a way of thinking that is from common ground, a unified movement against colonialist governments in support of land reclamation. The new Native America would be governed under Native law. People from the settler community would not be expected to give up their homes if located on Native land. Deciphering who is European, who is African, and who is indigenous is not so clear-cut after 500 years of intermingling. While land reclamation is part of the solution, it is not enough. A radical social education is needed to facilitate the development of land-centered revolutionary consciousness. You can skip the Grande card. Let's go on to case. Solvency. Turn the plan forces indigenous communities to assimilate to Western legality. Even if they grant them negotiation and equal access power, the table is still stacked against them. That risks community infighting and the extinction of culture, proving a turn to case. Tali Corpez in 99. Western IPRs push ownership over indigenous knowledge. The concept of ownership will have to be internalized, even if it goes against the practice of making available such knowledge. Their identity survival becomes dangerous because it might be appropriated. Bilateral agreements are forged between corporations, governments, indigenous communities, and indigenous people are pushed to play in a game in which the rules are defined by the opponents. Rights to self-determination rights to self-determination are undermined. It undermines ethics because what underpins is privatization to allow patenting the ultimate commercialization of life. And turn, the 1AC's attempt to reform to end colonialism and biopiracy increases tropes of pathology and gives the green light for surveillance and monitoring of social bodies. This increases security tactics and makes intervention inevitable. That makes corporate exploitation happen post-AF. Laringa and Dose in 14. Lapsing, relapsing, and recovery are tropes of pathology that inscribe a demarcation between the normal and the pathological. The use sets the stage and invites forms of intervention that operate on the grounds of therapy. Traditional politics are set aside through the need to provide the rehabilitation of the social body, appearing to be rendered apolitical, open to continuous and indefinite monitoring and reassessment by external agencies. This discursive strategy delegitimizes local politics and gives the green light for the disciplinary and rationalizing intervention of outside forces. Security and democracy are subsumed by the rationalities and techniques of the good and proper form of governing that has demanded one's health and welfare of populations becomes the objects of politics. Cut objects of politics. And turn the 1AC, that turns the D-colony-C into an empty signifier to qualm settler anxiety. This promotes the neoliberal power of white settler subjects and turns the aft, tuck in 12. Decolonization as metaphor turns decolonization into an empty signifier. Decolonization must involve the reparation of land simultaneous to the recognition of how the land and relations to the land have already been differently understood and enacted, not just symbolically. Indigeneity promotes multiple forms of settler anxiety. The easy adoption of decolonization as metaphor is a form of this anxiety because it is premature attempt at reconciliation disturbed by our own settler status. The desire to reconcile is just as relentless as the desire to disappear the native. The self-positioning of people as simultaneously the oppressed and never an oppressor, and as having an absence of experience of oppressive power relations enables white speakers to utter them sanguine into the normalization of liberal analysis of power relations. Cut the card there. They say reforestation. First, reforestation does not solve warming. Impossible to know and predict and guarantee sequestration. Only stopping production of carbon can reverse warming. Smoker and 7. The only way to address global warming is to stop drawing more carbon. Offsetting fossil fuel emissions by planting trees does a little to address climate change. Trees are fragile means of storing carbon because it's impossible to know and predict. They say food security, but the affirmative's depiction of food security relies on neoliberal economics as the measure for social well-being like food prices. This displaces structural critique and legitimizes colonial and biopolitical violence, which turns the aft, Jutzel and 12. Despite the food crisis lacking a concise timeline and being dispersed across the global desperate effect, the price of food allows a unitary logic. Food prices elevates market signifiers as a universal measure to enact an urgent call for action. This coordinates forward grounded are directed by prices. Cut the card of prices.
Good to start?
Sorry, what?
Are you good to begin?
Yeah.
Let's talk about your interpretation.
Sure.
What are topical affirmatives under your interpretation of topicality?
Sure, I can give a couple.
Okay.
Ban bioprospecting in oceans. Ban bioprospecting within the Amazon. Ban bioprospecting of ocean microbes within marine protected areas.
So the crux of, under your interpretation, the AF would only get access to banning bioprospecting in the ocean?
No, the argument is that we are able to parametricize or have different forms of bioprospecting stop in different geographic areas.
Where?
Yeah, again, we can do it on different aspects of land, like public parks, like
So then-
nationally protected land.
So
we
then,
can do it in
just to make sure I got
oceans.
this right,
Sure.
the only solvency mechanism under your interpretation is an outright ban.
Yes, because
So-
the job of the affirmative is to prove that bioprospecting is bad. Yes?
So then, okay, let's go to the links on your criticism. Actually, let's start with the alternative. Do you give back the land?
I endorse a decolonial pedagogy which situates it as first political priority.
So do you give back the land?
The argument is that obviously me speaking this speech into performance is not going to give back the land.
So
it's
no.
a question of how we are able to censor that in terms of what we teach within academic spaces and debate. Just because
You
you've
didn't
read
read
the
that
1
card,
AC
though.
does not mean that prior informed consent has passed through U.S. law.
Sure,
The point is,
but
is
you
that
don't
we're
read
meant to
fiat
test
as
the
illusory.
desirability.
But you
Right.
don't read fiat as illusory, so that becomes irrelevant. But let's talk
I mean,
about...
like, that's the point of the criticism, right? Like, you don't have fiat. I thought everybody understood that, but that's fine. I mean, do you really think the plan passed?
Let's talk about your Foster 11 evidence.
Sure.
So can you show me where this evidence talks about prior informed consent?
Yes. Attention is placed on legal technologies such as prior informed consent.
And can you explain what context Foster is talking about?
Yeah, so the context would be that your notion of prior informed consent still operates within an idea of public domain when it deals with patents.
Okay. And these are descriptive of prior informed consent in the status quo?
Also the way that it would be modeled with the affirmative.
Can you explain where that line of logic is? Because you would have to prove that Foster is writing about Grebbe's version of prior informed consent.
Okay,
Where's
cool.
that evidence?
So obviously, Foster does not have every single piece of literature for everybody that does prior informed consent. You are going to come up here and say that your version of prior informed consent is different. That is the way the debate functions, but that does not mean that Foster is wrong in the notion about how prior informed consent would have to happen. Your argument with the affirmative is that
Let's
you
go
give
to-
indigenous people negotiating power that still operates within patent law that is structured without their knowledge. That
Let's-
is the way it works.
Okay.
That is your own solvency evidence.
Show me that.
Cool, I will. I mean, do you really want me to spend the rest of this cross-section?
Show me
defending
the
your case
card
more?
where it says that.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's your link. I want to see it.
Okay, cool. Let me pull out your case.
While you're finding that,
Sure.
what is the status of the alternative?
Unconditional, unless I go for theory. So I can either go for T in case or the K in case, never both.
Sure.
Okay, starting prep.
No, can you find that for me?
Yeah, cross X is over though, so.
So you couldn't find it.
Yeah, in 20 seconds while you're asking me questions, absolutely.
I'll begin prep time.
Cool.
I'm good on prep time. There's a minute or two remaining. Okay. First, we will start with topicality. We will go to case, the criticisms on bottom.
Criticism in order.
Yes, the criticism will be in order.
Do I need Carson in here?
Yes, ma'am.
One AR finals.
Yes, sorry, 1AR finals. You got it pulled up?
Yep.
Great. You all ready to begin? The first arguments that I meet their interpretation bioprospect, I would prevent any kind of forms of biopiracy that gets conceded out of the 1AC, which means you always prefer my interpretation. The second argument are the dissats to the interpretation. There were two. First, he overlimits. Remember in cross-examination, the only mechanism I have is to ban all bioprospecting. That does not offer enough ground for the affirmative. That means he will always be able to get links predicated off of banning. That means no, the affirmative has no ground to ban. The second dissat to the interpretation is that it overlimits. That means the 1AC gets put into a small box. He only says we can deal with oceans or banning prospecting that happens in the United States. That is not real world because bioprospecting restrictions occur in different contexts. Go to violation. There is no violation here. They're literally the exact same thing. This is my counter interpretation. This is patent law is a form of a restriction. This is Dr. Torrance, Kansas University, 2007. Innovations or potentially benefit society that access them should not be legally restricted by patent owners. Rather, access should be given legally to assured by preventing concentrated ownership, attempting monopoly control patents to confer upon the owners. The counter standards first is limits. Without being able to discuss patent reform, the negative significantly over limits the firm. This hurts education because we never get to go in depth about how patent applications affect the bioprospecting debate. Go to effects T bad. 3 reasons why it's good. A, it increases education. Discussing it outside the resolution creates breadth of education overall. Second, real world. And real world proposals aren't limited exclusively to the topic. And second is reasonability. Checks back are still germane to the resolution. The counter interpretation is bad. Creates a race to the bottom. This always means that he will always have the ability to win. Go to inherency and harms now. Overview. All of these terms on case are completely non-unique. They are not in the context of prior informed consent. In addition, they're descriptive of the status quo. It becomes try or die for the affirmative. Go to his first piece of evidence now. His first card indicates that I'm tackling in high areas, and that creates more conflict. There are 2 responses here. First, this evidence is from 1999. It's not in the context of prior informed consent. The second argument is that my Cunningham evidence, which is from 5 days ago, indicates that the reason why conflict is occurring in the status quo is because there's no access to prior informed consent. The plan is able to resolve that issue by ensuring that they have lane recognition and benefit sharing agreements. His second link argument. He says the plan increases bioprospecting tropes. There are 2 responses. First, this evidence is intriguingly not unique. Secondly, it's not in the context of prior informed consent. And third, the 1AC is able to resolve this because bioprospecting decreases post-plan. That's the kind of 12 evidence that goes conceded out of the 1NC. His third argument says that my attempt to solve letter colonialism reinforces Western mindset. There are 2 responses here. The first argument is that I'm able to resolve this because the plan ensures that we regulate the relationship between the United States company and how they interact with bioprospecting, which means you always prefer the affirmative there. Secondly, my McGee evidence indicates we're able to solve back for the mindset becomes the plan, becomes the only way for us to give back land, which means you always prefer the 1AC over the alternative. 4, I'm not going for deforestation. I don't need go to this talks about food violence. He says that my rhetoric about food violence means that it turns the after response here first. This evidence is not unique. There's no way the critique is able to resolve that argument. But secondly, he concedes my Jackson 09 evidence. This is damning for him. This indicates that war becomes inevitable, probably to back solvency for the 1AC. It also means that I outweigh in terms of impact calculus. Go to my subpoint E on solvency now. You can extend my contour evidence that indicates that deterring becomes a pre-mechanism, which means you always solve back. But next, you can extend my dual 13 that says self-determination becomes a prerequisite for indigenous communities. That will be important on the critique debate. Go there now. There are dissats to the criticism. The first is self-determination. There is no way the 1AC that he's going to be able to resolve self-determination. My evidence indicates that it requires the United States federal government recognize these land rights to ensure that the plains being able to be resolved. Go to his Foster link or Tucking Yang first. His first Tucking Yang argument, you can cross-play my McGee 09 evidence. It specifically says that prior informed consent is a necessary part of restoration of land. This is not a generalization or equivocation of colonization. My evidence from the 1AC recognizes the importance of indigenous land and institutions that are prerequisites necessary to weigh the alternative. On the Foster link, turn. Foster concludes with the affirmative, saying that informed consent models avoid universalism. This is Laura Foster evidence he read. It says, thus, a productive public domain must be flexible and alternative in order to avoid traps universal under law. For example, more flexible benefit sharing and informed consent models based on visions of traditional knowledge and commons. Next, I solve the impacts. First, adhering to prior informed consent would halt neocolonialism. This is Benjamin Scoville, professor in his book 2015. Adhering to prior informed consent would undermine neocolonial land grabs and enrich the food expense of many, requiring upfront source layouts, increased risk of investment, sounding wealthy with new depths and uncertainty, tribal redress, avoidable pitfalls of many international mechanisms will provide an effective only for distributed resource and power to victims political economic and process we described. Next is no solvency in turn. Go to the alternative. The alternative uses a theoretical abstraction that will only lead to a real change to bioprospecting continues as a practice that only leads to ineffective criticism and missed opportunities of constructive engagement. This is Castrino 2. The relative ineffectual language that reflects criticism of bioprospecting have deployed and bound with their highly academic institutional ground. This especially is so on bioprospecting because many of the advocates are grounded in the world of environmental policy led to argumentation of passive coupled with the missed opportunity of constructive criticisms routing the frame analysis is viable. Alternatives can be imagined tends to speak less about the language unlikely policy savvy advocates if current bioprospecting practices are be effectively evaluated and practice alternate criticisms must speak the language of power that understands under view here. This evidence indicates that alternatives that fail to engage in bioprospecting activities will always be shut out by the state. This means the alternative has no solvency. The perm. You can do the plan in all other instances with no argumentation of why my plan puts us past the point of no return. There is no reason to believe implementing the alternative in all other instances won't be able to solve. However, without my plan, my case impacts become dissatisfied the alternative itself. This is an offensive why you must include the affirmative and put the negative in a double bind. Either the alt is good enough to resolve my plan is done, or it was never good enough to overcome the status quo. Either way, you vote affirmative. Remember, he does not give the land back. This is very important. The alternative solvency fails. He's been reading this position has been read throughout the entire round. If the argument is true that we can decolonialize ourselves, it should have been able to be solved through the reading of the alternative. It means you always prefer the affirmative. I am try or die for the Jackson 09 evidence that goes conceded.
Yeah. Prep time. How much time do I have left? I'm sorry, my. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Okay. So, the order is going to be the criticism in the order of the permutation, the alternative, the impact, the links. Then we're going to go on to harm/inherency for a little bit, solvency for a quick second, then topicality. Is everybody ready to go? can extend across perm, do the plan, and then the alternative all other instances. I'm not going for the criticism. Do not let them advocate for this permutation. Perms are just a test of competition. My argument is that if I'm able to win a link that proves that prior informed consent actually expands colonial logic, that's a reason why you can vote negative regardless of whether or not I win T, because it implicates its solvency mechanism. None of the offense against the alternative is able to be net benefits to the permutation, nor does it advocate anything against the links. I'm going to the impacts. I'm still going for racialized, colonized violence. My argument is that if you do not understand the way that colonialism is able to structure itself through social logics instead of just literal plans, it does not matter if the affirmative is able to increase modes of self-determination through increments. The argument is that within a colonial world, they will always be viewed as disposable, which means that self-determination does not actually become an actualized thing, which means there's no reason to vote for the affirmative. You should not give them any sort of new arguments within the next speech because they never address the impacts. So I'm going on to the link. He addresses the Foster evidence, but he misses the first piece of evidence from Schumann and 12 that's based upon research about how prior informed consent is able to operate, that says that it is a form of cultural intervention to assimilate non-Western cultures into a model of Western liberalism. The argument is that in order for consultation to happen, corporations, in order to be able to get the patents that they want, must be able to go through multiple levels of tribal hierarchy, which means that is able to, through research, prove that self-determination is actually undermined. This proves a terminal solvency deficit. It turns any of his arguments because he assumes a world in which you are able to consult that for some reason you have power. Our argument is that corporations can still intervene, which means that they can still do biopiracy, which means that there is no ability for the affirmative to be able to resolve any of this. Let's go on to harms and inherency. If I'm able to prove the turns onto this, then all of the arguments about biopiracy do not matter in this world. Second, you can go on to solvency. I am still going to go for for the Lyringa and Dosa and 14 evidence. This is very good at explaining the ways that intervention happens specifically with prior informed consent means that it's pathological. The argument is that corporations and governments will go into tribal communities to make sure that they are okay, and this has a form of paternalism in which the United States federal government operates as a notion that they are giving them their liberation. Finally, we have been able to give you forms of negotiating power. This still maintains a power differential between indigenous communities and those on the bottom rung of society, which means that he has not met the nuance of solvency. Look at the warrants that came out of the last speech. He's trying to flex in cross-examination, but there is no explanation whatsoever of what the plan does that is distinct from what I am saying, which means that you cannot allow him to have new forms of argumentation. This is my last speech, which means that you need to hold them to a very high threshold about what is on your flow and what's going to come out of the next speech. I'm going to win topicality. You did not do a good enough job. We're going to the interpretation debate. Extend across my interpretation that restrict means only outright prohibition. Castillo makes a distinction here. Effectual consequences do not equal a prohibition. Their we meet argument does not meet that distinction. Prior informed consent laws still promote bioprospecting. He only restricts it based upon the decision of communities, which means when he says he prevents any form, that is definitely not true because indigenous communities can still say yes and no, which means that when I read disadvantages or counterplans, he can say that indigenous communities would also go in that way, which means that there's no ability for me to have any offense. His argument is that I overlimit because I ban all bioprospecting. I'm going to give two reasons as to why this is definitely not true. My argument is that you can find specific forms of bioprospecting, and not only that, but specific forms of geographic locations. It's just a question of whether or not you prohibit. They give a counterinterpretation that says that patent law equals a restriction. Look at that card. Literally nowhere in that card does it have the intent to define what restriction means through legal circles. It just says patent law is a restriction, which means that I'm the only one that is providing a definition of what restriction means, and that means that you can only default to it being prohibiting. If they cannot prove that they prohibit and ban power prospecting, then I have one reason as to why my interpretation is uniquely better. We're going on to the violation. They violate because consultation is a regulation, not a restriction. My Sinha evidence creates a clear distinction where regulation promotes the facility, whereas prohibition it has the intention to prohibit. The question you should be asking yourselves at the end of the day is, does the plan directly prohibit bioprospecting or does it just give a barrier? Look at the plan text in a vacuum. Just because we have prior informed consent, first, after that, indigenous communities must say yes or no, which means that in a vacuum, the plan does not prohibit anything. We're going on to the limits debate. The AF explodes the topic and tilts competitive equity in their favor. Regulations circumvent negative offense because our disads are based on prohibiting bioprospecting. It justifies dozens of AF cases that create minuscule regulations that the negative cannot predict. Predictability is uniquely key in this instance. Even if they prove there was a literature base for the affirmative, my argument is that predictability guides how negatives research. Being outside those bounds means the literature base is never even accessed by negatives in the first place. That deters topic education because it forces negatives to rely on generic disads and counterplans and makes it a race to the bottom to outweigh the app. Instead of focusing on the internals or the processes, now it just becomes a question of who is able to get to the bigger impact first. They say, over limit, I have a few responses. First, there are dozens of case affirmatives that can happen under my interpretation. Ban bioprospecting in national parks, the Amazon, create MPAs, ocean microbes that have medical purposes. The argument is that if we're able to find specific forms of bioprospecting within different geographic areas, it gives them enough flex. Second, this proves that there's a topical version of the app. Ban bioprospecting on indigenous land literally solves back all their offense about self-determination because it stops corporations completely. Third, even if we over-limit, it's good. Depth is better than breadth. It forces to focus on topic controversy and in-depth debate, allows for more knowledge to be retained. Breadth justifies a bad model of debate because it makes it a question of who can get the biggest impact instead of internal link chains. Look at your flow. He is dropped bidirectionality. There is a risk that they are able to say that bioprospecting is both good and bad, which makes the negative always within a circular logic that forces double turns. He has also dropped that regulation should be counterplaying ground. You should default to competing interpretations. They should prove that they are topical. The reason for this is competitive equity in education. I've given you multiple reasons why, under a world of competitive equity, this is the way that we're able to get inside the debate round, which means that this doesn't matter about whether or not it's real world. We're in finals of NFA, which means that I should deserve to win instead of being pushed out by the affirmative.
A minute or two, I'll start. That biopiracy never exists. This meets his interpretation of prohibition because it functions as a restriction at the same time, which means that the plan means I'm able to meet this. But secondly, he concedes the second dissat to the interpretation, which is ground, which means he overlimits. The only mechanism of solvency for the 1AC becomes a ban. That means that there are several things that are not topical. First, we could never do any kind of patent reform that overlimits the affirmative. Second, we could never do anything that has to do with GMOs or any kind of regulations of DNA sequencing or informed consent laws that relate to healthcare or DNA sequencing. These are all disadvantages prove that he overlimits. But the next thing I want you to do is go to the bottom of the flow. He concedes competing interpretations are bad. It's game over for him. Now, the reason why you prefer this is because he can read any interpretation that he wants, and he creates a race to the bottom. And the negative can always try to time skew the 1 and C by going for Solom's deficit and also going for T, which means that we never get access to a fair debate of the 2AR. That is proven abuse in this debate round with the 1 and R, which is why you always reject competing interpretations. The criticism, inherency, solvency. Listen. The only way you get uniqueness for your criticisms is if you have an alternative. When you kick the alternative, all of your terms become non-unique. It is game over and try or die, because even if you believe there's because I will win that I saw back self-determination, go there now. His first argument indicates that research is about prime informed consent in the models and that there is no distinction between the two. But remember, my kind of October evidence says that companies get deterred from engaging in bioprospecting activities. In addition, he's defending the status quo, which means it's try or die now. My Grabby evidence says that my Pierce 14 evidence that he does not respond to indicates that as long as there's no consultation, certain indigenous communities will continue to be exploited against. But secondly, my McGee 09 evidence also says that 100 million people end up dying because there's no violation, there was no articulation that which means becomes try or die for the affirmative. The second thing, he says that I increase radicalized violence. This is devastating. My Scoville 15 card, it does not responded to. It says that bioprospecting is the new form and root cause of neocolonialism. That guts all of his impacts there. There is no response to that. It becomes try or die for the affirmative. It's a question of who can solve back for neocolonialism. That is me. My evidence indicates two things. First, we can solve back for land recognition, which solves back the alternative. But more importantly, my evidence also says that because it would cost so much, that bioprospecting efforts would be deterred post-plan. Neocolonialism is the biggest impact in the round because it controls the internal link to racism, which means you always prefer the affirmative there. Inherency harms. There's one argument that he makes. He says that communities will continue infighting. Remember, that evidence comes from 1999 and is not indicative of the status quo. But more importantly, I'm able to resolve that issue because my McGee evidence, my McGee 09 card that goes conceded says that because indigenous communities are pending against each other right now, prime form of consent becomes try or die. That's the only way to resolve the conflict that exists now. It is try or die for the affirmative.